Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
I am going to start with the moment that made everything simple, the moment when the noise in my head turned into one clear sentence I could repeat without shaking, because when my mother leaned back in her chair at the end of Thanksgiving dinner and said, in that calm and practiced voice she uses when she wants to look reasonable while cutting someone cleanly in half, that I was old enough to figure life out on my own, and that I should not come back here, I felt something old and heavy slide off me, like a coat I had been wearing out of habit even though it never fit, and while my aunt tried to swallow her shock and my cousin stared at his plate and my father cleared his throat as if the room had gotten dusty, I just sat there and watched her. Almost like I was watching a video of my life and finally understood that the people who say they love you can also be the very people who count on you never noticing how they keep you exactly where they want you, which in my case meant close enough to pay for things and far enough to blame for everything else. I did not shout, because shouting would have given them something to point to later, a tone to call disrespectful, a scene to retell with all the dramatic details polished and rearranged until it sounded like I had ruined the holiday, and I did not cry. Because I knew if I started I would apologize and then I would be the one handing out napkins and smoothing sleeves and promising to be more grateful, which is the oldest loop I know, so I just took a slow breath, nodded like I was considering a reasonable suggestion, and let the words land in the middle of the table where everyone could feel them, because you cannot unhear your own mother giving you the kind of permission that is really a punishment, the kind that says we are done pretending you belong here. Take your stories and your boundaries and your inconvenient memories and go be independent somewhere else. It would be easier if I could tell you that this came out of nowhere, that I had been wrapped in warmth and fairness for years, and then suddenly the curtain was yanked down. But the truth is this had been building quietly inside the chores I was still asked to do when I visited, inside the little jokes about how I made more than I used to and could pick up the check. Inside the careful forgetting of the years I covered the electric bill after my father lost work and the months I paid for my mother's prescriptions without asking for a dime back, because I had a credit card with a small limit that turned into a larger limit and then into a safety net, and somewhere along the way the net flipped and I became the one hanging. And they became the ones calling it our family emergency fund when they booked a weekend away and told me after, or when they upgraded a phone plan because they needed better service, or when they bought concert tickets and said it was fine, they would send their part later, which somehow never arrived. So I sat there and watched my mother deliver the line she had probably rehearsed, the one that would make her look decisive to her sisters and strong to her friends and merciful to herself, and I realized I was not actually in shock, because my body felt strangely steady, like it had been waiting for someone to say out loud what the behavior had already made clear, and when my father mumbled something about how people move on and families adjust, and how he and mom had given me such a strong start, I almost laughed, not because it was funny but because it was the exact script used by people who want the benefits of your adulthood without the trouble of treating you like an adult, which would mean accountability. And that is the one bill they never want to see. I helped clear plates because I always help clear plates, and when my aunt offered to pack leftovers for me I said yes, because there is no reason to decline food unless you want to turn a room into a courtroom. And after the kitchen noise and the clatter and the small talk about traffic and sales and who is traveling for the holidays, my mother found me in the hallway near the old family photos and said she hoped I understood and that it was time for everyone to grow up. And I looked at the picture where I am 8 and standing at a school recital with a smile that still believed being useful meant being loved, and I told her I understood perfectly, which was true. And I walked upstairs to the guest room that used to be mine and closed the door as gently as I could because slamming it would have made them feel justified. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my overnight bag and at the tote where I had tucked a few documents I never leave behind when I travel home. The kind of papers you keep because you know that in certain families the person who keeps records is the only person who ever gets the truth straight, and I let the quiet do its work. Because if you listen carefully after someone tries to evict you from your own history, you can hear the difference between fear and freedom, and I knew there was a decision to make, not about whether to leave, since they had answered that for me, but about whether I would go on letting them treat my resources like a faucet they could turn on without asking, which would make me complicit in my own erasure. Or whether I would finally do the unthinkable and act like the grown woman they said I was by setting a boundary that would not bend the moment someone faked a cough and sighed about being tight this month. I thought about the past year and the way I had coached myself through one small compromise after another in the name of keeping the peace. And I remembered the message my mother sent in the spring asking if she could put a hotel deposit on my card because their account had a hold, and how I said yes and then later paid the entire balance because arguing about it would have cost more than money. And I remembered the time my father used the card at a home improvement store and told me the cashier must have swiped the wrong one, which was such an obvious lie I could feel my cheeks get hot even alone in my car, and I realized that what happened at dinner was not a change in policy so much as a change in tone, and that the only person whose policy needed to change now was me. I will not pretend I did not want to text an old friend or call someone who would tell me to breathe, because of course I did, but some moments do not want witnesses, they want action. And I knew that if I picked up the phone to vent, I would soften and spin and rationalize. And when morning came, I would be loading my trunk with a smile that said I was fine while the same auto payments kept sliding out of my account for people who had just told me I was temporary. So instead, I opened my laptop and stared at the banking tab I know too well, the one with the shared card they use for emergencies that somehow look like dinners out and weekends away. And I hovered for a long minute, because this is the part where you either keep living the way you have lived or you choose the version of yourself who will not apologize for acting like your life belongs to you. The house had settled into that quiet night pattern where you hear a television murmuring from down the hall and the dishwasher running and a door closing softly, and I clicked into the account and watched the list of recent transactions appear. A tidy column of small bites and a few large swallows, and I scrolled until I reached the setting I had never used, the one that would turn the card from a promise into a memory, and I sat there with my finger above the trackpad and my breath steady and my jaw unclenched, and I understood that this was not about punishment, it was about alignment, which is the adult word for finally letting your actions match your boundaries, and I made a choice that would change the morning in a way none of them could spin. Because when dawn came there would be no discussion, only consequences, and I closed the laptop on that thought and lay back without turning off the lamp, already hearing my mother's line over and over as if it were permission I had been waiting for, and with the screen's glow still fading across the sheets, I reached for my phone, opened the banking app, and tapped into the shared card settings with a calm I had not felt in years, ready to decide exactly how much of me they would get from now on. I lay there longer than I meant to with the banking screen open and the little toggle staring back at me like a dare. And I thought about how that card started as a temporary fix during a rough patch when my father's hours were cut and my mother said they just needed a cushion until things stabilized. And I agreed because I was raised to be useful and because the word family pushed every button in my chest. So I added them as authorized users and told myself I would keep an eye on it, which I did, right up until I started ignoring the transactions that made me uncomfortable because choosing peace felt cheaper than another argument about intention. And over time the emergencies began to look a lot like dinners where they hosted friends and picked up the check with a flourish, or a weekend escape that I learned about through photos, or upgrades on a phone plan that somehow became my plan because I was already the one paying it, and all of that would have stayed gray and complicated if my mother had not spoken so clearly at that table that night, because once somebody tells you not to come back, you have two choices. You can keep sponsoring the version of you they prefer, or you can do the boring, grown thing and turn off the faucet they've been pretending is a river. What finally moved my thumb was not anger, although there was plenty of that humming under my ribs. It was the memory of the last time I asked for them to slow down on the card and my mother smiled and said of course, they would be mindful. And then the next day there was a charge for a salon and a note from her that said she had forgotten and could I please cover it this once. And I remember reading that message while walking to the subway and feeling the kind of smallness that makes you look at your own shoes, because I knew that the word family had been stretched until it could cover anything they wanted and almost nothing I needed, and I decided I was done being generous in ways that erased me. So I slid the toggle and the app asked me to confirm and I did, and then another screen appeared that let me choose whether to notify users and I did not, because I was not interested in a debate about tone or timing. I was interested in boundaries that existed whether or not anyone approved. I slept in pieces, the kind of half-sleep where your mind practices what you will say and then edits it again and again until there is nothing left but the bare sentence, and I woke before dawn with that sentence sitting in my throat, and it was not a speech. It was not a defense. It was a simple line I could deliver without shaking, and I packed my bag quickly, checking the folders where I keep copies of anything with my name on it, because I have learned that in this family the safest place for the truth is wherever I put it, and I carried my things downstairs one by one, taking my time not because I was stalling, but because I wanted the loading of the trunk to feel like what it was, which was a transfer of weight back to me. And when I stepped into the kitchen, my mother was already there with a mug, and that breezy morning voice she uses when she wants to establish that last night is already old news. And she said she hoped we could keep things cordial and that she wished me the best. And I said thank you, and then I said the line I had practiced, which was that I wanted her to know I had canceled the card they use on my account. There is a very specific look a person gets when a hidden arrangement is suddenly dragged into daylight and they did not get to script the reveal, and I watched that look pass over her face so fast she tried to pretend it was a trick of the morning. And she asked me what I meant in a tone that wanted to sound patient, and I said exactly what I meant, that the card was closed, that there would be no charges from now on, that any automatic payments linked to it would fail unless they updated them with their own information, and I added that I had removed my account from the family phone plan and from the subscription they said was a shared entertainment cost, but which I alone had been paying. And I kept my voice low, and even because I knew if I lifted it even a little she would grab tone like a life raft, and I would spend the next hour arguing about manners instead of money. She set the mug down without drinking and tried a different angle, which was to tell me she was disappointed I would do something so drastic without warning. And I said the warning had arrived last night at the table in front of our family, and that I had heard it loud and clear, and I told her that adults sometimes make decisions that other adults do not like when those decisions protect them. And she did not like that sentence, not even a little, and she called for my father, who came in, rubbing his eyes and acting as if he were walking into a simple misunderstanding, and I repeated the information calmly, and he said there were a few charges pending and perhaps I should wait until those were processed. And I said I was finished waiting for anyone to behave in a way that respected me, and then the moment that felt like a scene I had seen in other people's houses finally arrived, because her phone buzzed on the counter and she glanced down and her face went still. I did not need to read the screen to know what it said, because banks have a way of texting when a payment declines, and I watched her scroll and tap and then pretend to read a different message that did not exist. And I understood that somewhere a restaurant or a store was trying to run the card they had assumed would always go through. And behind that moment were a dozen other moments I would never see where a plan made on the assumption of my endless sponsorship would start to wobble, and for the first time I did not cushion the fall, I did not offer to split the difference, I did not ask questions with answers designed to make me responsible for fixing everything, I just zipped my bag and wheeled it toward the door. Because this is what a boundary looks like when you stop explaining it and start living it. On the porch my father tried one last time, the soft version, the appeal to my better nature, the suggestion that family should not keep score, and I said that I had stopped keeping score the day I realized I was the only one paying attention to the numbers. And he told me I was being unkind and short-sighted, and I told him I was being clear, and then my mother stepped outside with her phone still in her hand and asked if I had also touched the account that pays for their car insurance because she was seeing something strange, and I said not yet, which is true because I am orderly even when I am done being accommodating, and I told them that from this moment forward anything with my name on it would be under my control. And anything with their names on it would be under theirs, and my mother started to say we could discuss it like reasonable people, and then her phone buzzed again, and the sound of it in that exact second was so perfect I did not have to add anything, because she was already walking back inside fast, and my father was already dialing, and I was already lifting my bag into the trunk when the screen of my own phone lit up with a notification I had set hours earlier. The one that would tell me the first automatic charge linked to that card had been declined, and that a secondary contact had been alerted, which meant my mother's voice would be the next thing I heard, Only this time she would not be delivering a speech. She would be asking a question, and I was ready to answer it in a way she would not forget. I did not look back, because looking back is an invitation to negotiate with yourself, and I was done negotiating with the version of me who thought comfort bought with silence was a bargain. So I drove with the steady focus of someone who has finally aligned her words with her actions, and I told myself I would not answer the first call, or the second, or even the third, because those calls would not be about understanding or apology. They would be about control, and I had already returned that to its rightful owner, which is me. Yet the car had barely reached the end of the neighborhood when my phone lit up with my mother's name and a message that said we need to talk right now, and then a second that said the card is not working. And then a third that tried a softened tone about an honest mistake and how a pending payment just happened to be processed at a bad time, and I let them stack without opening because I wanted to feel what it was like to choose the sequence for once, to decide when and how the conversation happened, and to remind myself that urgency can be faked, but consequences cannot. By the time I reached the main road, my father had joined the chorus with a message asking if I had thought through the impact on things that matter, followed by a voicemail that tried to sound calm while his words tripped over each other. And when I finally pulled into a gas station to breathe, I pressed play with the kind of detachment you reserve for a podcast about strangers, and I listened to him explain that the card had been used to pick up a prescription and that the payment had been declined, and he wanted me to understand that health was not something to hold hostage, and I almost smiled at the speed with which the story had shifted from dinners and weekend escapes to medicine. Because it always does when people want to shame you back into compliance, and I said out loud to no one that adults who need something stop making speeches and start making arrangements, and I put the phone face down so I could hear my own mind again. What I did next was not dramatic, it was boring in the way that power often is when you are not used to having it, because I opened my email and pulled up the folder I keep for anything that shares my name and their obligations. The one with scanned forms and account numbers and the notes I started taking the day I realized memory is no match for selective recall, and I saw in black and white the cosign I had done for them when they swore the payments would be light and temporary, and the automatic withdrawals I had set up in a moment of kindness that had somehow become a permanent arrangement, and a list of subscriptions that read like a quiet biography of what they enjoyed on my dime, and I felt that same calm return. The one that had guided my thumb over the toggle the night before, and I knew that this first wave of chaos was not an accident of timing, it was the predictable shudder of a system that had leaned on me for too long. I drove to my apartment with my phone still buzzing now and then, not like an alarm but like a metronome counting the beats of other people's reactions, and once I was inside I did the smallest, pettiest thing first, because sometimes you need the tiny win that reminds you the big ones are possible, so I changed the passwords on the streaming accounts and the music service they used more than I do. And I set the profiles to private so I would not have to watch my name pop up on their television, like a ghost still paying the cable bill. And while it sounds trivial, the quiet relief of closing those doors made room for the larger work, which started with calling my bank to confirm that the card termination had propagated to every merchant and that no backdoor reactivation could be authorized without my explicit consent, and I took notes in a plain, unemotional list. Because feelings were not going to run this, facts were. The afternoon brought the first real crack in their composure, not in words, but in a forwarded email that my mother accidentally sent to me instead of my father. A message from a salon where she had a standing appointment gently noting a declined auto payment and asking whether she wanted to update her file, and although the subject line was mild, the CC list included her friend who handles their neighborhood committee events, which told me my mother had been using the card for more than household basics, and almost as if the universe wanted to drive the point home, a second notification landed from the insurer for the utility protection plan that covers their house, the very one I had added years ago because the furnace was old, explaining that the monthly debit had failed and that a lapse would be reported if no replacement method appeared within a short window. And in that moment I saw not just embarrassment, but a map of their self-presentation unraveling, because the places where they like to look put together were the same places that would now be asking for money they had expected me to provide. I still did not call, because there is a difference between ignoring people and refusing to be baited into a conversation designed to reset the story. So I replied to no one and instead opened the lender portal for the small loan I had co-signed when they swore it would help them bridge a season and would be gone before I even noticed. And the numbers on the screen were not catastrophic, but they were honest, showing a couple of late fees they had never mentioned and a pattern of almost on time. That told me my name mattered to the bank more than it ever had to my parents, and in that clarity something inside me clicked into place, the sense that leverage is not about threats, it is about knowing exactly where you have been standing all along. And although I did not touch anything yet because I wanted to move carefully, I changed the mailing address for notices to mine and set alerts so I would be notified the instant anything slipped, because if my name was going to be attached then, my eyes were going to be on it. Evening came with a final message from my mother that was not a message at all but a bare instruction, call me now, and attached was a photo of a paper taped to their front door that I recognized from years of apartment living. A friendly but unmistakable notice from a utility about a returned payment and a reminder that service interruptions can occur if an account remains unpaid, and I stared at the image, not with triumph, but with the steady comprehension that I had been underwriting there. Image of control for so long that the first truthful reflection of their own management looked like a crisis to them, and I typed a reply that was neither cruel nor comforting, telling her that I would be available to talk at a time of my choosing and that in the meantime she should contact the companies directly to update her payment methods, and before I hit send I attached a single line that would change the tone of every call that followed. A line that said I have also updated the address and contact preferences on any account that includes my name, which means notices will come to me now, and as I pressed send and watched the 3 dots of her response jump and pause, my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. The lender's fraud and credit department asking to verify a change request I had not yet made, but someone else had just attempted on my behalf, and as the representative asked if I wanted to approve the addition of a new user to my account, I finally smiled because the next move was going to be mine, and this time I would make it with the kind of precision that leaves no room for revisionism. I answered the unknown number not because I suddenly felt generous, but because I've learned that the fastest way to stop other people from rearranging your life is to make sure your name is the loudest one on the file, so I told the lender no. I did not authorize any new users. Yes, I wanted a note placed on the account that changes required my voice and not a story told by someone claiming to act for me, and while the representative typed I could almost hear the old rhythm of my family trying to outrun consequences, the scramble to get ahead of the narrative by acting first and asking forgiveness later, which works on people who are afraid of conflict and not on someone who has finally decided to treat herself like a person who matters. And when I hung up I sat with the quiet and looked at the folder on my screen that I had labeled years ago with a calm word that made the whole thing sound like tidying, when what it really was a map of where my goodwill had been used as both ladder and rug. I opened the credit report I pull every year, and I looked at it the way a contractor looks at an old house, not with nostalgia but with a pencil behind the ear and a list of what stays and what goes. And I saw the loan I had co-signed still sitting there like a small stone in my shoe, and I thought about how many times I had told myself it was fine because it kept them afloat and because I could carry it. And then I thought about the way my mother had leaned back at that table and dismissed me like a temporary problem, and something inside me settled into the kind of clarity that does not need an audience. So I placed a fraud alert on my file not because I believed they would commit a crime, but because I know how quickly desperation dresses itself up as practicality when the bills come due. And then I called the loan servicer and asked about the process to remove a cosigner, knowing full well it is never simple, and I listened while the agent explained refinancing and payment history and income verification, and I said fine, send me the checklist, and I made a note that even if removal took time I could still bring light to every corner of that account so there would be no more surprises hidden behind polite voices. From there I went back to simple, unglamorous things that changed the temperature of a house more than any speech, which meant logging into utilities and removing my card information, switching every notice to my address so I would see the truth first, Creating a spreadsheet with due dates and contact names because people who have controlled you for years count on your exhaustion, and a list is a way of telling your future self that you have her back. And while I typed, my mother's messages kept sliding in with that tone that tries to sound measured, but is already sharp around the edges, asking how I could do this when they had always supported me and reminding me of favors from years ago, as if gratitude runs on compound interest while debts sit politely in the corner and wait until you are ready. And I did not respond because I have finally understood that responding in the heat of someone else's panic is just volunteering to be their airbag, and I have spent enough holidays pretending bruises were hugs. The next call I made was the one I had put off because I knew it would cause the most noise, which was to the homeowners association office that manages the neighborhood where my parents like to brag about curb appeal and community standards, as if those words were proof of character. And I gave my name and asked to confirm the account status for a property where my email was currently listed as the payer on file, and the woman on the phone read off the address and then hesitated before telling me there had been a string of late payments that were cleared by a card under my name, and that a new quarter's dues were coming up within a short window, and I thanked her and asked her to remove my card immediately, and she did. And then in a voice that was kind but firm, she mentioned that if the dues were not paid within the posted grace period, the account would incur a late fee and a notice would be mailed, and if that notice went unanswered, a lien could be filed as a matter of policy. Records being public and all, and I said I understood, and I wrote it down without adding a single dramatic flourish, because the facts did not need help. It would have been easy to call my parents right then and get dragged into the swamp of old fights and half-promises, but instead I did something smaller and more effective, which was to email the association office a formal letter stating that I was not the owner, that I had previously paid as a courtesy, and that all future communications regarding delinquency or fees should go directly to the listed owners at their verified address, and I copied myself and saved the sent message in a folder called Proofs, because there is a point at which caring about what people say you did becomes less important than being able to show what you actually did. And after that I moved to the phone plan where my name had been wedged into a family account like a donor plaque. And I removed my payment method and the secondary user privileges that had turned me into a walking upgrade, and when the system asked for a reason I typed the true one, which is that the account holder had told me not to come home, and I had decided to listen. By late afternoon the calls were no longer righteous, they were anxious, and my mother's messages came with the quick staccato of someone who finally understands that the audience is not buying the performance anymore, asking whether I had contacted the association and what exactly I had done to the lender and how I could think it was acceptable to embarrass them after all they had done for me. And the part of me that still wants to cushion people almost answered with something gentle, but I have spent too many years smoothing the edges of other people's choices, so instead I opened a separate folder I keep for community emails and found the message about a winter fundraiser my mother had signed up to chair. The kind of event where she shines because it lets her look generous in front of the exact people whose opinions she treats like oxygen. And attached to that message was a draft program listing sponsors and committee names, and a note that final proofs would go to print at the end of the week, and there, in crisp lines, sat my mother's name with the word sponsor beside it, paid by an account that was no longer mine to provide. I wrote a 2-sentence email to the fundraiser coordinator, 1 sentence to withdraw the sponsorship that had been charged using my card and to request an updated invoice to the correct party, and the 2nd sentence to confirm in writing that no use of my name or funds was authorized going forward, and I sent it and sat back and watched the small ripple move across a pond they thought would always be still. And within minutes a polite reply arrived thanking me for the clarity and attaching a revised proof without the sponsor line, along with a note that the committee list would also be adjusted because membership requires dues paid in full, and I read it twice because it was proof that reality, when allowed to do its work, is more effective than any speech. And then I took a screenshot of that revised program page with the blank space where my mother's public flourish used to be, and I texted it to her without commentary, just the image and one short line that said they asked me who would be paying, and I gave them the only honest answer I have, and before she could type a single word my phone lit again, Not with her name, but with a calendar alert I had set for myself weeks ago and forgotten. A reminder about the renewal date for a storage unit my parents have used under my account for years, which means tomorrow morning a manager will call the primary contact to ask for a valid card before late fees begin. And I stared at that little rectangle of truth and finally let myself exhale, because the storm I feared was not a storm at all. It was just weather, and weather passes, and as I silenced the alert and set my phone face down, the screen flashed with an incoming call from my mother. And I answered it knowing that for the first time in a long time I would not be the one scrambling, because she was about to ask me how to fix the mess I had made, and I was going to tell her how to fix the mess she had made instead. When I picked up the call, I did not brace for impact, because impact is what happens when you are not staring, and I was staring, so I let my mother ask her questions in the tight voice of someone who has realized that the audience has left and the lights are on. And I listened without interrupting as she moved from accusation to injury to nostalgia, telling me I had humiliated them, telling me I had forgotten everything they did for me when I was young, telling me that a decent person does not weaponize money against family. And when she finally ran out of air, I spoke in the same even tone I had used at the kitchen counter, and I told her what I was not going to do, which was argue about feelings over facts. And then I told her what I was going to do, which was finish the work I started and leave them with a clear list of what belonged to me and what belonged to them, so there would be no more confusion. And she said confusion was not the word she would use, and I said that was fine, because I was done borrowing their vocabulary to describe my life. I started with the easy, almost kind part, which was to explain that I had contacted every company where my name or my card had been tied to their comfort, that I had removed payment methods and secondary permissions, that notices and statements would come to me until the files were corrected, so there would be no quiet surprises used later as proof that I had abandoned them. And I told her that the Homeowners Association had been notified that I was not the owner and that all late fees and dues were the owner's responsibility, and I heard the tiny catch in her breath that said she understood what public notice meant in a neighborhood built on appearances. And before she could pivot, I added that I had also declined the attempt to add a new user to my account that morning, and that a fraud alert was on my file for good measure. And there was a long pause where I could feel the old script trying to reboot and failing because it had no place to land. I could have stopped there and let the natural math of their choices do the rest, but I had one more piece that mattered, not because it was flashy, but because it was honest, and honesty, when you are done being afraid of it, is the most disruptive thing in a family that runs on selective memory. So I told her I had prepared a single document, a plain timeline with receipts clipped in chronological order, not for the internet and not for revenge theater, but for the only group that had been used as a captive audience for years, which was our extended family, who had heard the story of my supposed independence while enjoying dinners I had quietly financed. And I said that at noon I would send that document to the family group thread with a short note saying that I loved them, that I wished everyone well, and that beginning today my financial support to my parents had ended, and I would be unavailable to discuss it for a short period, so I could reset my life with some peace. And I said the timeline would include a few clarifications about the so-called emergency fund, like the hotel deposit that turned into a beach rental the same week I covered their electric bill, or the salon plan that renewed every month on a card labeled household, or the winter fundraiser sponsorship that bore my name without my consent. And my mother said that would ruin them, and I said no, it would simply stop me from carrying the story they preferred. She tried the softer ground again and told me that families make mistakes and that they had been overwhelmed and that none of this justified the spectacle of a shared message, and I told her that the message was not a spectacle. It was a boundary delivered in daylight, so there would be no more private edits later, and I added the piece she did not see coming because it was not dramatic and it did not require a threat, it just required a decision, which was that I had already scheduled a call with the loan servicer for the cosign note, and that I would be initiating the process to remove my name through their standard path, and until that happened I would make all notices come to me, and I would confirm or deny any proposed changes on a recorded line. And I said that if payments slipped, I would cover the minimum to protect my credit and immediately file for reimbursement through small claims, not because I wanted to fight them in court, but because a filing creates a record that is not subject to anyone's memory, and the word record is one my mother understands better than the word feeling. I did not raise my voice when I said the last part because it did not need volume, it needed weight, so I told her that there was one piece I had not mentioned yet. The little vacation fund that had been explained to me years ago as a set of points and discounts that were such a good deal we would be foolish not to use them. And how those points and discounts had been built on charges run through my account under the label travel category to earn bonuses faster, and how I had set a simple rule last night that I would no longer subsidize a story in which I was the unreliable daughter who could not be trusted to show up, while my money showed up on time every month, and how that rule came with a practical conclusion, which was that I had already transferred every remaining point and accrued credit associated with my account back to my profile and closed their access, and that if they wanted to take a trip they would be paying for it the same way I now pay for peace, directly and up front. There was a silence that felt longer than it probably was, the kind of pause that happens when someone finally figures out that you were not bluffing and that there is no stage left to perform on, and then my mother asked what I wanted from them, and I said nothing, which stunned her more than any list would have, and I repeated it slowly so there would be no mistake. I want nothing. I am not asking for repayment or apology or a scene. I am asking for absence, for a stretch of time where my phone is quiet and my name is not used as a hinge for your doors to swing on, and then I added the only condition I needed, which was that if they ever decided to speak to me again they would do it on a call that began with a sentence about what they had learned rather than a demand for what I should do. And I told her that I would send the family message at noon and then I would mute the thread for a while, not as a punishment, but as a practical measure while the dust settled where it belonged. At noon I sent it, not with a flourish and not with a caption, just the timeline and the calm note and a wish for a decent holiday season without confusion, and within minutes the replies stacked up in a pattern I recognized. A few shocked questions, a handful of private messages from cousins who had suspected something and were relieved by the clarity, a quiet text from my aunt that said she loved me and that she would handle her own holiday budget, and then nothing, which was the point. Because silence is often the space where people decide whether to change or to double down, and I am not the manager of those choices anymore. I am just a person who decided that if you are going to tell me I am old enough to figure my life out alone, then I will take you at your word and figure it out without sponsoring the version of yours that depends on me staying small. I closed my laptop and let the room be ordinary because ordinary is what I had been craving while I mistook chaos for closeness, and when my phone finally vibrated again it was not my mother or my father. It was the storage unit manager confirming that the account on file had been closed and asking if I wanted to remove myself from the contact list, and I said yes, please, and thank you. And when I hung up I understood that the final move had not been the document or the points transfer or the canceled card. The final move was choosing, again and again, to do the clean thing even when it made me look cold, because clean is what happens when you stop dragging your past through every present moment. And as I stood there with a plain afternoon in front of me, I felt something I had not felt since before I learned how to keep other people's plates spinning, which was a quiet that did not ask me to pay for it, and if you still want to know whether it was too far, I will tell you the truth. I wish someone had told me years ago that the line between too far and finally far enough looks like a boundary from the outside and feels like oxygen from the inside, and once you feel it you do not go back.